Are you covering too many topics in your podcast or not enough? And how do you know what's the right thing to do? Many podcasters struggle to find the balance between topics, and that's exactly what we're talking about today. Welcome to the Podcast Cafe, where we're serving up everything you need to know about podcasting, from tips, stories, and strategies for podcasters from podcasters. I'm your host, Hayleigh Hayhurst, the founder of Espresso Podcast Production, a full-service podcast agency helping business owners, creatives, and thought leaders launch and grow their shows. Whether you're just starting out or want to take your podcast to the next level, this is the place for you. Each week, we'll dive into practical tips, actionable strategies, and of course, stories from other podcasters so that you can build up a podcast that you love and that works for your business. So grab your coffee, get comfortable, and let's get started. Welcome to the Podcast Cafe. I have been hearing this conversation pop up more and more recently, so I decided to hop on here on a solo episode just to talk about the different topics you can cover in your podcast, because there is a very unique answer, and I think it's different than any other marketing platform. For many of the businesses that I work with, they're already established and they're just using their podcast for extra marketing, or in some instances, they are using the podcast to build their business as their main source to connect with new people. And in both instances, there's a way to cover topics that's interesting to you and your audience. And then there's a way to just really confuse your audience. And that's what I want you to avoid. So let's talk about niche podcasting versus generalist podcasting, because I think that's a great way to start this conversation. So unless you're a generalist podcast, meaning you talk about literally everything under the sun, which I have thoughts about, and we could talk about that in another episode, but niche podcasts, I believe, are really the way to go, because then you're focused on a topic, but you still get wiggle room to explore different areas of your niche. For instance, this is a niche podcast, right? Podcast Cafe. People are coming to listen to my show to learn more about podcasting from podcasters for podcasters. But in this podcast, I speak with podcasters in all different industries, from wellness to bridal to I have a conversation about wine coming up. I have business coaches. I have mindset coaches. I have authors. I have the episode with Alicia Kumar all about her lifestyle podcast. So it's really important to know your niche before we get too far into this episode. Think about this. What is the niche of your podcast? If you know this, great. If you don't know this, I would do some deep dive into what your podcast is really about and who it's for. I always say this is kind of like if you watch a movie and someone says, "Oh, what's the movie about?" and you can't explain that movie to anyone else, that's hard to make them want to watch it. So make sure that your podcast is explainable, and the easiest way to do that is by having a niche. I had a person come to me about a year ago who wanted to start a podcast, and so I said, "What's it about?" And they were like, best places to park in the city, and conversations about politics, and new events coming up around me, and things in the news. And I was like, oh my goodness, that's a lot to cover. And it's hard to build your audience when they don't know what's going to come next. Is it going to be another political episode, or is it going to be another parking episode? And no shade, some podcasts are like that, and honestly, do whatever makes you happy. But for the businesses I work with, it's best if you can pick your niche, and your niche should be the same as your ideal clients. So, what do they care about? We'll get more into that in a second. Having a clear focus on your podcast really leads to having an audience that keeps coming back and grows, and then you have retention. So, how will we create these topics with your brand, business, and expertise? That's what I want to talk about. I really think it all comes down to what you want from the podcast. Is it to build trust? Is it to make sales? Is it to get something off your chest? Like maybe you really hate a parking lot. I don't know. Or is it to build awareness around something? I recently connected with someone who wants to start a mental health podcast for kids in her area, and that's building awareness. So you really need to know your niche and what you want to get out of your podcast, I think, to have the best results. So, yes, you can talk about multiple topics, but I like to have a structure and framework around this. So, we're going to be talking about creating pillars or buckets for the topics that best fit your audience expectations. Because too much variety can confuse your audience, but not enough variety can get boring for you, the host, right? So, like I mentioned, in this podcast, I bring stories from other podcasters. I talk about my podcast history and a little bit about my personal life, and I also talk about business. So, if I started talking about my favorite dog breed, which I love a good mutt, my dog is a mixture of like so many different dogs, but mainly pit bull and chihuahua and poodle. I don't know. He's a little cutie. But if that was like the entire episode where I was just like, this is my favorite dog breed, and that's it, people would be like, where are the podcast tips? If I started talking about my dating history, while some of you may be entertained, again, you might be confused as to why Hayleigh is talking about these random topics on her podcast about podcasting. So that's why you need content pillars. An easy way to think of your content pillars, if you haven't done this work already for your Instagram account or TikTok, is just to think, what are the main places or the main things I want to post about? And let's think about it for both social media and podcasting because they are very similar, but I'm going to give you a hot take at the end. So here's mine. I talk about podcast mastery, like how to grow a podcast, how to start a podcast, podcast strategy, behind the scenes of podcasting. I also talk about entrepreneurship and business growth, such as starting my business when I was 22, scaling my business, the systems and workflows behind my business, and then also just the thought leadership. I also talk about marketing and visibility, obviously, because that's what podcasting is all about, getting seen and getting your voice heard. So, leveraging a podcast for business growth. These are all things that I talk about across Instagram and my podcast here. What I do differently with my podcast, which I think you'll think is interesting, is I talk more about my personal growth and lifestyle here on the podcast, whether it's my other podcast, Employee to Boss, or it's Podcast Cafe. I don't post much about my personal life on my Instagram. That's mainly just those three other buckets: the marketing, visibility, entrepreneurship, and podcasting. Here on the podcast, it's totally okay if I want to tell you about my dog or if I want to talk about some mindset challenges I've had throughout the years, if I want to talk about my travel, or if I have, you know, whenever I travel, I usually take my work with me. For the most part, I love a good break, but I will work from like a hammock sometimes, and this is the life that I wanted to live. And so I'll talk a lot more about like balancing business and personal life on here. And then I'll also just talk about like the half marathon that I ran that I used podcasts to get me through, or this marathon that I'm training for, or like wellness or things like that that come up. And the reason I'm able to talk about this personal growth and lifestyle here on the podcast, but not on my Instagram, is because the conversations I'm having on here are deeper than what I'm posting on Instagram. On Instagram, I'm just posting tips and tricks and all these things. And yes, my personality will come through on that, but I'm not going to make a post necessarily about something that's going on in my personal life. That's because it's my business page. Whereas here, we get a more intimate setting where I can tell you more. And when I'm interviewing guests, let's say that they talk about their wellness journey, it's something similar that I've been through, I'll tell my story. We're building rapport here, and that's different than what you do on Instagram. So that's why I say you can have more content pillars on your podcast and not on your Instagram, and that's totally okay. My business coach, Kate Perkovic, her episode on my show is coming up soon. She talks about her personal life a lot on her podcast, and it's because she's building trust with her audience so then they can go and connect with her. There's things that we can connect with each other on a deeper level when we're having a longer conversation or a place as intimate as a podcast. And it's so funny saying it's intimate because like thousands of people listen, but and it's like out there in the world, but it's different than a public post, right? This is inside the container of my podcast. So that's a little bit about mine. And I thought it might be helpful if I break mine down so then you can get a real life example of what your pillars could be. Another cool thing about podcasting is once you kind of have your rhythm down and you know what you're talking about and you have these buckets and pillars like I just mentioned, if I wanted to take my personal life onto my Instagram and start doing more personal things, I could see how it works on my podcast, see if anyone is interested, and then go and post on social media. Like I mentioned, that's actually what Kate did with her podcast. She started talking about more personal life on her podcast. People were eating it up. People were signing her to be clients left and right. And then she decided to go and start posting more personal stuff. But podcasting is a great place to test it because you have those direct analytics. You can see how long someone listened to your episode. You can see where they're located. You could see how many people listened. So it's nice to be able to test things out here and then use the analytics before you introduce it into maybe your already established brand. So let's say you've started your podcast already, because when you're just starting off, you can experiment a lot more. And this tip I'm about to give you will work for both established and new podcasters. But let's just say you are an established podcaster, you have, I don't know, more than 30 episodes up there, and your podcast is doing well, but you just want to get it to the next level. Here is my advice. Look into your analytics. So I just hosted a VIP day with a client today, and the first thing I asked her to do was like pull up your RSS feed and let's look at your top episodes. And she was really surprised to find that they were all of her solo episodes that were doing really well and a few guest episodes. All of her episodes were good. They were all great. They were all getting great listens. But the most successful ones that she did were actually her solo episodes or ones with big guests. So, what that tells me and what that told her was more people want to hear about her in her podcast. They want to hear her solo episodes. So, she's in the spiritual space, which is a very interesting niche to look into, but you can do this in any niche. I know business coaches that will look at their top performing episodes and like double down on that. I've done this audit for my show every single quarter with Employee to Boss, and I know that the topics that work best over there are ones on marketing and sales. Those are really what people in their first stages of business want to hear about. I still do episodes on all different things. Every single topic I'll cover over there. But every time I look for new guests, I go over into my analytics, I look at my top episodes. I'm like, okay, people have been really loving episodes about finance lately. Let me go find some financial experts and have them on the show. And the only reason I know this is because I'm testing out different industries. I know that automations, like learning about automations, that isn't the most popular episodes over there. It might be what I know my listeners need, but it's not what they want to listen to, so I don't do as many. And then same with real life examples from my life of growing my business. People love those. So I try to throw them in as much as I can. But what really I love doing on my podcast is having guests. So I really try to focus between what's a good guest episode and what's a good solo episode and what's a balance of the two. So audit yourself, audit your podcast. The way I would recommend doing this is going into your RSS feed. So this could be anywhere that you host your podcast. Look at your all-time downloads and look at your all-time top episodes. Then, after you look at those, you might be shocked, you might love it, you might hate it. Look at the last 90 days. What are the most popular episodes from the last 90 days? And do you see any trends? Okay, after you've done that, I would recommend if you have your podcast hosted on Spotify for creators or have an account on there, go in there and look at the completion rate of the episodes. And then also go on Apple Podcast Connect. You set this up when you put your episodes onto Apple the first time, so you have an account. I know the person I was talking to earlier was like, I don't have an account here. And I was like, you definitely do because your podcast is on Apple Podcasts. So go to Apple Podcast Connect, log in, Look at your completion rates for those episodes too. This has been a hot topic in the podcast world lately of how long are people listening to your episodes. It's good to know because if you want to, let's say your marketing episodes get 80% completion rates, whereas your sales episodes get 45, you know that people are more interested in marketing. On the flip side, this is where you can promote your business and run your ads in a better spot. A lot of people, a lot of podcasters will wait to promote their own services or freebies or whatever it is until the very end, your outro, where let's say, I don't know, 30% of people aren't even getting to. So having insights into your analytics is really going to make this whole what content pillar niche, what are people interested in? It's going to help you figure out what to actually do and what actions to actually take. Okay, well, this is a quick deep dive, which I know is funny. We covered a lot in this episode, and I hope that you really are thinking about what your niche is, what your content pillars are, and then are your episodes too scattered or too repetitive, or what do you need to do to make your podcast the most interesting? So audit your show, think about your content pillars, pick like 3 to 5 for future episodes, test them out, be adventurous, see how they perform. One podcast episode that doesn't perform as well is not going to tank your whole show because if you try something and it doesn't work, okay, now you know. If you try something and it works, okay, why weren't you doing that before, right? So test things out. For instance, maybe try a personal story if you don't do those already. So just see what's working, what's not working, and if your show is new, all right, you have a clean palette to test these topics out, but you should absolutely go in with some content pillars. If you need any help with this, I offer strategy sessions where I would love to do a deep dive into your podcast and would love, love, love to help you kind of iron out these details and get you set up for the next quarter and beyond because I want your podcast to give you the results that you want it to have. I want your podcast to drive clients to you. I really want your podcast to do what you want it to do. Success means different things to every single podcaster. I will say that till I'm blue in the face. Success means different things to every single podcaster. So what does success mean to you? And how can we make your podcast work in that direction? All right, you guys know where to find me, Espresso Podcast Production on Instagram, and I will catch you in the next episode. Thank you so much for joining me in the Podcast Cafe. I hope you're leaving with fresh ideas and inspiration to take your podcast to the next level. Remember, podcasting is a journey and you don't have to do it alone. I'm here to help you every step of the way. Let's connect. Be sure you follow me on Instagram at Espresso Podcast Production or visit espressopodcastproduction.com for more tips, resources, and behind the scenes insights. I'd love to hear about your podcasting journey. If you've enjoyed today's episode, make sure you hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you're feeling extra generous, I'd love it if you could leave me a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It helps more podcasters just like you find the show. Until next time, grab your coffee, keep creating, and I'll see you back here in the Podcast Cafe.